Afternoon. I'm glad a couple of you filtered their way in. I was worried we were going to have a discussion between maybe one or two of us, but that would have been all right as well. So hopefully the sound of my voice will coax a couple more people gently through the door. Well, I hope everyone's enjoying their conference so far. Just to contextualise what I'm going to talk about in a moment, a lot of what you will have heard so far today will have very much been based on a building type level. I want you to take a slightly different mindset for what you're going to hear for the next 15 minutes or so and start thinking about what we need to do on a city-wide scale in terms of data and in terms of future planning and forward planning. So for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to run through the role that technology plays on a much, much larger scale, macro scale across cities. I'm going to tell you a little bit about where VU.CITY comes in. We're going to talk about the importance of geolocated data and how that's critical and how we understand how our cities change over time. And then we're going to take a really brief look into the future, and I'm going to make some predictions on where I think we're going to go from here. So hopefully I don't need to stress too much about the importance of technology to the people in the room today and online. I think we're probably all relatively persuaded that technology is going to play a really critical role in how our industry evolves. But it's really important to consider what that means to us on a city-wide scale as well as in individual buildings. Planning is facing some really serious problems at the moment, both in the immediacy and in the future, and we've got some really big challenges to tackle. Take, for example, the climate crisis. It's probably one of the biggest things that we need to consider in how we design our cities of the future. We've got growing populations, and we need to consider what increasing density looks like. There are changes to behaviour following COVID-19, and we need to look at what that means for the places that we design. And we need to also make sure that our cities are adaptable for the future so that we're not constantly having to shift them, so that they're appropriate for different purposes as we move through. We've also currently got a cost of living crisis, which inevitably is going to start turning attention to housing affordability and what that cost is for new homeowners. So there's a lot of big problems, and big problems require us to think across boundaries and require us to think a little more collaboratively than perhaps we're used to. We really need to shift away from having a linear type of thought process and think about a multidisciplinary approach where we've got lots of different people coming into the process and giving their expertise and knowledge, and that needs to be done in a digital way. We really need to understand the way in which our cities are changing and what it is that's driving that change. And a really core part of that is understanding data. It's probably one of the most important things in understanding how our cities change. So I'm going to touch on two things here. Firstly, how we understand data, and secondly, how we leverage that understanding, what we do with that information that once we know it. So actually, a lot of the principles of BIM tie into this really, really quite nicely. The future of data on a city-wide scale is that it has to be delivered in a digital form. It needs to be used by multiple different parties. It can't just be for people who are planning the cities. It needs to be for the people who are operating the cities and analysing them too. And we need to see an increase of standardisation to make sure that people can do that in a uniform manner across different cities and internationally as well. And that unification, that standardisation, also means that we can interpret the data that we see much, much more easily. The good news is that in the UK and in Ireland, we're kind of heading in the right direction. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening in that location. The first thing that I want to touch on is the Digital Task Force for Planning. This is a group in the UK who are looking at what we need to do to make a digitally enabled system, where we are now, what that path looks like, what the future might be, and what that's trying to achieve, but also what the main barriers are for us to get to that point. One of the things that they pick up on is we should be thinking about whether or not we need to have regional centres for data that collect spatial information on the places that we live in and that can converse with each other and share that information so we can learn how to design our cities in a better way. So the public and the private sector are both really, really considering this and looking at what that might mean and how they need to adapt how they're collecting data to fit in with that. Over here, the RIAI have released a planning initiatives proposal where they're starting to think about, should we be considering data in our cities in a 2D form, or actually, should we be starting to think in 3 dimensions instead? Should our development plans be in 3D? Most master plans have got a maximum buildable height. Why is that something that we're seeing in a 2D format? Why aren't we designing within that in a 3D space? Why is that not something that's universally achieved? And what other benefits could that have? And finally, I'm just going to touch on the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill that's going through the UK Parliament at the moment. This bill is introducing some new digital powers that if it goes through and it becomes an act, then local authorities are going to have the power to demand that information is given to them in a digital format. They're going to be able to demand that that is done in a certain form and a certain standard, and that will be part of the legislation as long as it all goes through. So we're getting there, and we are heading in the right direction. But the second part is, once we have that data, how do we leverage it? How do we make the most out of what we now know? And what really controls our ability to understand the data is how we can imagine it. How does that apply? How can we apply that thought to the spaces that we live in? And that's actually a really difficult thing to do, reading a load of numbers on a piece of paper and applying that to real-world examples. That's really, really difficult, and that really limits our ability to interpret the data that we're reading. But that can really be enhanced by visual aids. And if you don't believe me, I have a little bit of a fact to support it. Our biology is designed to understand visual information better than text. The human brain actually processes visual information 60,000 times faster than text. It's more efficient, there's no debating that. We're also, and I purposefully haven't written this down to see how many of you remember this in 3 days' time, we're 55% more likely to remember a fact if there's a visual cue. If any of you remember that over the weekend, you're one of the special few. So, visual cues are really, really important in us being able to understand information, remember it, and able to use it in the future. And that is where VU.CITY comes in. We create 3D context city-wide models that show how our cities are changing and apply data over the top of that to allow us to understand the change that we're seeing and adapt in the future. We allow our users to test and iterate within both current and future context. They can assess that change. They can design different iterations in response to the change in context that they're seeing. And also, we can evaluate our cities based on those changes and look at forming strategic policy based on that. I'm going to look over to our neighbours in Belfast just for a moment and show you an example of where this is creeping its way into policy. So this is the Belfast Tall Buildings SPG, and they used our VU.CITY models to evaluate where their buildings over 35 metres AOD were, so they could pinpoint where those emerging tall building clusters were coming through and how they needed to adapt their planning policy in the future to take that into account and make sure that the policies that they were creating off the back matched what was happening in the real world. So we create these entire city-wide models, and we keep them up to date as well. So what we'll do is we'll scour through planning portals and discuss with local authorities about schemes that have been granted consent but actually aren't in situ yet. So on the left-hand side, you can see Dublin back in 2016. On the right-hand side, we're moving through to 2022, and you can see these yellow and blue buildings popping up. And that darker grey indicates that since 2016, those buildings have been built and they're in situ. The yellow buildings are buildings that have achieved planning consent, and the blue buildings are currently under construction. So you can see not just what's there now, but what's going to be there in 20, 30 years' time. We can look at how our cities are actually changing. Within that as well, you can create massing. So you can start looking at the potential of a site. You can start looking at what you might be able to feasibly fit onto a site. You can test scale, you can test height, you can start looking at bulk as well. And all of that whilst looking at the visual impact. You can place cameras on any point of the model, both aerially but also on the ground. So I can start walking through this model and see what that's going to look like when it's in situ. I can do that from the surroundings, but I can also do it from much, much longer ranges. So perhaps there are areas in the city where the view into the city is really, really special and needs to be protected. And I can consider all of that really early on in the design stages. And at later stages, once I've got something a little bit higher textured and higher details, I can bring those models in from different native formats. And I can put them into that wider context and truly understand the impact that that's going to have. I mentioned earlier that both the public sector and the private sector are working at how we look at these things in a different way. And this is a prime example. Rather than imagining what a scheme might look like once it's in situ, you can actually see it and walk around on the ground and see what the public are going to experience when they walk down that street. But data has a really, really massive role to play in all this, and it's really central to understanding the change and driving the way that we create our new cities. Being able to understand that at a spatial scale is really, really important, and being able to compare different sources gives us a deeper understanding of what it is that we're looking at. So here, for example, we can look at things like the Dublin City Council conservation areas. We can look at where the architectural conservation areas are on a much, much wider scale than we were able to before. You can look at air pollution levels. So perhaps you want to compare where those new buildings are popping up against what the air pollution is like. Where do we need to concentrate the density? Where do we really need to consider what effect we're having on the climate when we're building new sustainable buildings, and what impact that has on air pollution levels today? How does that affect transport networks? Where do the cycle lanes need to be? All of that needs to be considered on a larger scale. You can look at where strategic development and regeneration zones are, and all of this can be compared whilst you're going through those design processes and looking at iterating on your schemes. VU.CITY brings this all together under one proverbial roof, and you can really quickly and instantly understand what changes we're going through, how our cities are being shaped, and make decisions off the back of it. So you can design, analyse, and test, and look to the future. And I'm going to look to the future a little bit here at the moment. I'm taking a little bit of a leap because I know this is a conference that is focused around BIM, but we do need to think about what other applications we can use our 3D models for. And one such thing is community engagement. Community engagement in planning is a real issue, and it is a really important thing that we crack the nut of. And actually having visual tools is a really, really important part of that. Having visual tools that people can interact with. So what you can see here is, this is a community engagement that was run by Dacorum Borough Council down in the UK. And the points that you can see on the map, you can click into and drop down onto the ground, and you see these 360-degree images of proposals and of the streets that are around it. So you feel a little bit more enfranchised. We don't experience the world in 2D, so why should we ask people to make decisions on developments based off a CGI or something that's printed on a bit of paper? They should be able to feel it and experience it and see it from multiple different viewpoints. Accessibility is a big thing as well. How do we make this as accessible as we can for the future and for the public? We've been, for example, developing QR codes that we can sit in front of these 360-degree images, which may seem a little bit arbitrary, but think a little laterally. Imagine having a QR code on a hoarding, and someone can scan it, and they can see what building is being built behind it before it's even there. Suddenly people are engaging with planning a little bit more, and they understand the process that it's going through, and they want to be a part of it. So I'm going to start wrapping up now, because I feel like the lunchtime slot is always a tricky sell, and everyone's probably starting to think about what sandwich they're going to have in a moment. So I'm going to glance only a touch further into the future and make some predictions about where I think we're going to go, and a bit of a plea about what it is that we need to support it. The first thing that I think is going to happen is that we're going to be able to visualize more constraints. I mentioned height in master plans, but perhaps that should be drawn to airport safety zones. Maybe we should be visualizing more of our strategic views in a 3D way. Perhaps we should be thinking about our development plans being done initially in 3D that people can design within. There's lots and lots of opportunities to what we should be considering. The second, and this is primarily a plea, but also I am confident that we will get there. We need more shared and more standardized data, and we need that across countries, and probably at some point internationally as well, so that people can interpret the information they're getting and that they can apply it to models like ours and use that information to learn. This perhaps might be a little bit of wishful thinking, but I think at some point we'll see more codified planning documentation. There's a lot that sits within planning that is numerical or mathematical, and doesn't need to be hidden away in PDFs. We should be able to access that information, and it should be machine readable, and we should be able to create better designs through AI and generative design technology using that information. And the last thing is, we need to start thinking about the fact that I think a greater emphasis is going to be placed on how data gathered through BIM is going to shape our cities on a macro scale. I've left it until now to do a food-based analogy because, like I said, I don't think it's fair over lunchtime, but I'm going to wrap up with one. And I'm going to ask you to think about what we're doing as running a city is like running a restaurant. BIM is focused on making sure we have the best ingredients for each individual meal. What we're trying to think of is how that menu fits together. And a restaurant doesn't run well unless you know all of that. So that's all from me. We are just over there in the corner, so if you want to see a little bit more, we've got 23 interactive models that we can run through with you. If you want a little tour and hear more about what we're doing, more than happy to help. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. The QR code will take you straight through, and enjoy the rest of the summit.